Well, actually, this book will find its place in a long debate, conversation about the nature of EU external relation capacity. As you probably know, EU is not a state. EU is more than a classical international organization. So for years, scholars have been wondering what type of animal the EU is on the external scene. And one of the idea that was developed from the late 70s, early 80s is that EU is not a classical power, doesn't have strong military power whatsoever. So it's kind of a soft power, and then the debate evolved to the idea that EU is a normative power, meaning that it produces and exports norms, values. With this book, we're trying to figure out whether this capacity of the EU to be an important player in the global world is a capacity to frame the debate. So the title of the book, Framing Power Europe. Naturally, as academics, we have a critical perspective. So we're not saying it is actually framing, but the way we develop the methodology for this book is to try to figure out whether there are competing actors proposing different frames, and we focused on two elements that are quite, I would say, at the core of the discourse the Europeans have about their external policy, which are democracy and human rights. So basically, it's a comparative book. We're looking at other key players, strong power like the US, China, India, Brazil, to figure out whether they accept the framing that the Europeans are trying to promote around democracy or human rights, or whether they propose alternate framing, and if there is an alternate framing, whether this framing is influenced or not by the European attempt to frame the debate. Well, you know, as a good academic, I will never have a yes or no answer, but let's say the debate is fueled by this attempt of EU to frame the global debate. Now, whether it's a success or not, too soon to tell. What is interesting is that there have been a lot of theoretical debate and writing on that. But here we have case studies of the different actors on a comparative basis. And to our knowledge, that has not been done in a systematic way. So that will definitely be a strong input of the book.
I think that certainly a big aspect of it was that a lot of us got to collaborate with scholars who come from a bit of a different background, and the synergies that came from this interaction were definitely a source of innovation. There's a very innovative aspect in it that we are looking at how the values of the European Union have been framed from a historical perspective, and having done that, we actually reveal a counterintuitive narrative. We see that the values of the European Union have been framed outside in rather than inside out. And I think that that's the biggest innovation of the book. And the fact that we are able to back these claims with empirical evidence is really has really contributed to work that I'm proud of.
It's really interesting to show how basically, yes, EU is an actor of globalization, but this process of reaching beyond its own internal border is also framing EU itself. Actually, in the book, her chapter and a few others are dealing with EU itself, and then we have chapters dealing with the other actors. Mm-hmm. So naturally, they're quite different in their aim and their structure. So we have 3 chapters on Europe, and then we have about 9 chapters on other key players. So naturally, the other chapters are different. They're not trying to understand how Europe functions, but whether this attempt to frame by EU has influenced or not the domestic policy.
Quite interestingly, this chapter was actually an opportunity to explore a topic that was a bit different than my research. My research focuses on the European Court of Justice, whereas in the chapter I focus on other organs of the European Union, so the Commission, for example, and how it has framed the debate about the values that guide the external action of the European Union. So in that sense, it was very complementary to my research.
You have this impression, if you say, oh, Europe is kind of exporting its values, its principle, its method, somehow you have this really reflexive process. So they show in the chapter that EU is kind of testing some value promotion in its external policy, and then it gets imported, framing the debate inside the EU. So it's much more complex than we initially imagined. The output in the book, not only ours, but also the other one, is, let's say, a materialization of this culture of dialogue about this issue of globalization and the place of Europe in globalization.
It's a very exhaustive and innovative attempt at showing how Europe can, where on the political map Europe can be placed when we talk about the values of human rights and democracy. And I completely agree that one of the biggest innovative aspects of it is that we were able to mobilize different generations of participants in the Gemstones network, in the Gem network, professors. We worked together, and the product I'm really, really proud of. Even though it is a book about where Europe can be placed on the global map, it is also a very useful guide to people who, as Nicolas said, seek to study the European Union from the domestic perspective. Because as we showed in our chapter, the fact that the European Union went on to define itself externally first before doing so internally is a very important aspect of the way it has become democracy. So I think that scholars like me, lawyers who seek to also focus on the domestic aspects of the European Union would have a lot to gain from reading the book.